From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Open Line.
Everyone, welcome to Open Line. Glad you're with us tonight. We have a very interesting show. We're talking about the rise of hate groups in America. Why is it happening and how can it be prevented? And we are happy to have with us the author of a new book. I'll show you the book first. Here is the new book. It's called Hate in the Homeland, the New Global Far Right. And the author is joining us via Zoom from Washington, D.C., author and professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She is with the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. And so we'll talk to her about what that is. But Dr. Miller-Idriss, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
So we've seen you interviewed. Yeah, you've been interviewed on television shows all across the country because this is a very timely topic, and the book is hitting some very important issues that are concerning a lot of people. You say we are asking the wrong questions when it comes to far-right extremism. First of all, let's define what we're talking about and kind of what is the state of far-right extremism right now in the United States.
Great questions. And I say in the book, and I have often said when I talk about this, that I use the term far right, even though I think it's not a great term. It's sort of the best bad term we have available to capture this phenomenon. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But essentially, it captures a range of things that are working against democracy. They're anti-democratic or authoritarian in nature, set up hierarchies between groups of people. So usually white supremacist, but also sometimes male supremacist or Christian supremacist ideas, espouse the use of violence to achieve political goals, and often try to bring down entire systems. So extreme anti-government, anti-capitalist, anti-extremist systems that, extremism that's using anti-system rhetoric called accelerationist that wants to bring down all systems and then have a rebirth into a new civilization. So on every measure we have available, the largest percentage of that, I should say, is white supremacist extremism. On all the statistics dating back to about 1949, over those years, most violence has come from the white supremacist fringe. The second largest group is anti-government extremism, which is what we've been seeing a lot of this fall. So your viewers will be familiar with that in terms of the patriot militias and other anti-government extremist groups. But by every measure we have available, white supremacist extremism has been growing over the last several years, and that includes propaganda circulating, but also the numbers of plots foiled by the FBI, actual lethality. And so what we've seen is the number of deaths, are higher than any other form of extremism. And so we have finally seen a recognition of that. The Department of Homeland Security's report just this fall lists white supremacist extremism as the most lethal threat from extremism facing the nation. So that's where, the data is really clear. And I think the questions really then become, why is this happening? Why are we seeing the rises now? And what can we do about it?
Yes, and you address that in your book. And what you're talking about here also is the plot to kidnap the Michigan governor. Is that right?
Absolutely. Targeting of elected officials is part of this. We've seen an escalation in those kinds of events. And I should say, not just in the U.S. We've had a 320% increase in right-wing terror globally over the last 5 years. There was a political assassination last year in Germany by a right-wing extremist of a popular pro-migrant politician, the first political assassination since the Nazi era. We had the murder of Joe Cox several years ago in the UK. We've had targeting of governors here, of mayors, judges, of other elected officials that are being singled out by, in this case, anti-government extremists for their political beliefs and targeted for, to put them up on trial because of so-called tyrannical beliefs or other violence plotted against them.
Is this about racism, or is it about bringing down the government or bringing down systems? You keep talking about bringing down systems. Is it fueled by racism, or are they using racism for some other end?
Within the far-right spectrum, and this is where it gets messy, it's a spectrum. So within the spectrum, the majority of actors in that spectrum are on the white supremacist fringe. And so we're looking there at groups who are motivated by racism, by the desire for even a white ethno-state or separatist ideas about racial territory within this country. But we also have anti-government groups who are not necessarily motivated by race, but motivated around against perceived tyranny. What unites all those groups, regardless of whether they're motivated by race or by anti-government extremism, is a sense of threat. So it's how they define that threat that varies. They all share an idea that there is a existential threat, a dire threat posed to them, to their way of life, to their children's future, and that if they don't take immediate and heroic action, that threat, will prove the end of their race or their nation or their people or their civilization. And so you get these heroic ideas, and I say, heroism because they believe it's a moral act. They believe they're acting heroically in, attacking a synagogue or a mosque or, other terrorist attacks like we've seen, or believe that this is such a dire threat that they have to take action against a political official. So they get to such an extreme fringe that they believe that's what they're doing. So they do share a sense of threat, but how they define that threat varies. And there's some overlap in that Venn diagram where you have white supremacist extremists who are also anti-government extremists. And that's where it gets a little messy and harder for people from the outside to always understand what's happening.
And you write, if we are going to address the problem of rising far-right violence, we have to think differently. Changing the questions we ask is one place to start. What do you mean by that?
So most efforts to address terrorism in general, both on the Islamist and international side and on the far-right extremist side, have looked either at questions of why and how. Why is this happening, and how do these groups operate? How do individuals get attracted to them? So they look at things like top-down questions about the strategies and tactics of terrorist groups. Can they be infiltrated? Can we break them up? This is what the FBI does. Fantastic work infiltrating them, and we're glad that they've done it. But, or we have folks who are working on the side, like I have historically worked on the cultural or psychology of it, trying to figure out why individuals might be attracted to extremist groups from the bottom up. What vulnerabilities are there? What susceptibilities? Why are they believing this propaganda or letting themselves be manipulated in some sort of online environment? And what I suggest in this book is if you ask a different set of questions about where and when people encounter extremist ideas, where do they first run into them? What are the spaces and places that they run into the ideas? Sometimes it's a college campus, a flyer, a white supremacist extremist flyer. It might be a YouTube show where they're there to do something else, but somebody starts to introduce ideas. And so we have cooking channels that have done this, and DIY home improvement channels that have done that, where you get people introducing these ideas in these other spaces. And if you start to look at those spaces and places and understand how somebody might begin a pathway that takes them down that radicalization to extremism, that opens up a new way of thinking about where could we intervene and how could we reach young people. I'm interested in particular youth before they get so far down a pipeline that it's much harder to bring them back. And so that's my interest, is in interruption at early stages. And to do that, I think we have to look at this from a slightly different angle.
And that is interesting, where they're first being exposed to it and why it's sticking.
Right.
And so you're finding what? I mean, I think it's interesting. Many of the people, Dylan Roof, for example, his father, Dylan Roof, is the person who killed 9 African American worshipers in Charleston, South Carolina. His father said he didn't learn that from home, but his goal was to start a race war. That's what he wanted to do, a civil war, and that's why he brutally murdered 9 people in a worship service in church. 9 African Americans. His father's like, I didn't teach him that. I don't know where he got that. And so where is that? Is it coming from parents, or you're saying it's coming from somewhere else?
Yeah, in most cases, it's coming from somewhere else. And this is where I do a lot of work with parents. We're running a webinar tomorrow that people can tune into for parents and teachers to help recognize signs of online radicalization, because we're worried about, parents, especially at this moment with so many kids online all the time, and every, there's just exponential growth in the amount of time that people are spending online. So there's a lot of different ways. Sometimes 23% of online gamers encounter white supremacist propaganda and conversations about white supremacist ideology while gaming. And so, if your children are out there gaming, they have a quarter, a 25% chance, about a quarter of it, 23% chance that they're going to encounter this stuff. And what happens when they do? Most kids are going to turn away. They'll recognize it for what it is, but some people won't. They'll be drawn in. And so if we can start to understand what are those spaces, in the case of Dylan Roof, it was an online search that he Googled something, and he was Googling something and looking up information, and the first hit it took him to was a white supremacist website. So that is what we call a recommendation system, or a search algorithm. And there have been changes made to those to prevent that from happening again, to try to prevent that from happening again, to allow those extremist sites to basically optimize themselves in searches. There have been changes from the companies, the tech companies, to try to prevent that, but there are different ways in. Sometimes it's through online searches or an online space. Sometimes it's stumbling into something very mainstream in a mixed martial arts club or an online gaming platform or a YouTube channel, where you suddenly, music is another one where there have been very racist groups and bands that have created music since the 1980s, where the lyrics can work on youth in particular and inculcate them with kind of ideas. So each of these kinds of spaces are important, I think, for parents, for teachers, for coaches, for youth group leaders, for anybody who's working with young people, to understand what that means in terms of the kind of exposure that they might be having, so that one can, we can reach out to help inoculate them before they get to it.
Interesting you mentioned the mixed martial arts scene. I guess talk about that. Obviously, it's not all bad, but what's going on there that might open the door?
Absolutely not all bad.
But what's going on there that might open the door?
Yeah, and the thing about the combat sports scene is that it is the fastest, or one of the fastest growing sports in the world. And so millions and millions of people are participating in it. And the vast majority of them, of course, are never entering down any kind of pathway to extremism. But what extremist groups have discovered, and this is particularly started in Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia, they have been targeting the mixed martial arts, even creating dedicated tournaments and platforms and places to fight that deliberately spread ideology within those scenes that recruit. And they're doing that because, and it has spread a little bit here to North America as well, I would say not as much as in Europe. And in Europe, there are security services reports, European Union reports about it, intelligence agency reports. It's a very well-documented phenomenon there, that where you used to have far-right extremist youth kind of engaging through a very drunken soccer hooligan scene, drug-laden, fighting in the streets, in a drunk way. Now these are, they're kind of converting them into very regimented, straight-edge, disciplined warriors who will prepare for kind of street battles. And there's a long history here, because under the Nazis, Hitler also espoused the use of combat sports to prepare soldiers for street battles and to be warriors, and to kind of train like real men and soldiers and fight and be masculine. And so there's a lot going on in the mixed martial arts that makes them attractive as recruitment spaces for extremist groups. And this happens from Islamist extremists as well in Europe, that these spaces become a recruiting grounds. And so understanding that and understanding that as a mainstream place where you might have a young person exposed to somebody who's trying to use that space to recruit them, I think is what I'm trying to draw attention to in this book. Not that even some small minority of people in those spaces ever become extremists, but that they are sites that are attractive to extremists to reach out to your young people to find them, because there's some reason why that space resonates with what they need in their groups.
Yeah, and it's important to have that conversation. I mean, you mentioned in something you wrote that when it comes to being manipulated by the fast food industry or something, if children are told, well, they're using humor to manipulate you, then that's an effective tool to deal with it. They see that. If they're told just don't eat fast food, maybe they push back and they're like, well, mom and dad don't know what they're talking about. We need to kind of think about how to talk to our kids to inoculate them or prepare them or prevent them from going down this road. Is that right?
Exactly. And I think that's exactly the example we often use in the research lab where I work, is this research on years and years and years of public health research showing that, actually after all these years of trying to teach teenagers about the impact of healthy eating habits on a lifelong of health for their bodies 50 years into the future, it really has had no effect. They don't really listen. They eat whatever junk they want. But when you show teenagers that fast food companies have been manipulating them with the use of advertisements into buying food that's bad for them in order to line the profits of a company who's basically taking advantage of them and making money off of it, then they change their behavior. And the really interesting thing is that the behavior changes more for boys than for girls. And so, what we take away from that in the lab is nobody likes to be manipulated, but especially teenagers. And so if they find out that somebody else is taking advantage of them, then they rethink that. And so what we're advocating for, and what this book is sort of trying to lay out an agenda, is helping parents and teachers and other adults who work with youth think about, how do we inoculate kids against the possibility that they're going to encounter this kind of contagious nature of hate or extremism online in the spaces where they might spend time. Somebody shares a meme at school, a racist, a dehumanizing, or misogynist or sexist meme. What do they do about it? They all start sharing more memes. They're in a space, they're in a locker room, right? Where are the places that you encounter these kinds of things that become potential gateways to other information? Somebody invites you to a new website, a URL, a chat room online where there's a lot of toxic stuff being shared. And so most people are going to walk away from that. Some people won't. And so helping kids, in particular young people, understand why somebody might be trying to manipulate them and expose them to that, and what they can do, how they can talk to other trusted adults, what are their options, are really important preventative measures to sort of before they ever even get to the possibility of radicalization, we think, for everybody to kind of encounter. And we've done that really well with young kids on helping them understand predators and privacy, but we haven't done it very well about propaganda and misinformation.
So what is at stake? I mean, where do you think we are right now, and compare it to where we were, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Where are we right now? Are we kind of at a crossroads where we could go one way or another? And it feels like it might be worse. Is it worse?
There's certainly a lot more nefarious and bad stuff circulating out there online than there was 10 years ago. And part of that is just the sheer volume of new kinds of spaces and places where people can encounter this stuff. But it's not only online spaces, and that's one of the things I want to emphasize in this book, is that the online system underpins it all. But people might encounter this walking across a college campus or into their combat sports gym or whatever they're doing, and on a t-shirt at somebody walking into their gym, they see a t-shirt sold by a company and it says, my favorite color is white, but the t-shirt's purple. And what kind of joke is that, right? That's a real t-shirt that exists, right? So there's, these kinds of companies that sell coded messages on clothing. So they're going to encounter these messages in memes, in t-shirts, in music, in subcultural spaces. And there's more of that circulating. And part of it is the ease with which people can now, the authorship behind these things. You're not limited to somebody who can create a newsletter and send it out through a mailing list, right? Anybody can create a meme, throw it up there. There's the way in which this is kind of the democratization of knowledge sharing is bad in this way for the volume of bad content that people are likely to encounter. And so helping them understand what to do when they encounter it is, I think, a very strong public need, I think, and a parenting need, and a need for education. And
so when you saw the situation in Michigan, when you heard that there was a group out there that was actually plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan, were you surprised by that? Yeah. Or did you think, boy, this is exactly the kind of thing we've been talking about?
I was not surprised, but I think even when you're not surprised, you can be shocked. And so I would say I was shocked and not surprised. And it's shocking because anytime you see that level of sophistication in a plot or a plan, there was, rich detail, and they were really spending thousands of dollars on expensive surveillance equipment, really had a well-developed plot here. So it wasn't fly by night. It wasn't just talk on a toxic online platform. There was really a plot in place. And I think seeing that as part of a pattern, not just in the US, but internationally and globally, of escalating attacks on elected officials and rising far-right terror, I think is a really important point. And so I think it wasn't surprising, but it was shocking. And it's part of a much broader and bigger problem that we are likely to be contending with for some time to come.
And one more thing, then I'm going to start taking calls, and we have several calls already. But yeah, that I think people have thought, okay, these groups, they are on the fringe, they say terrible, hateful things, but they won't break beyond that fringe. But when I hear that the governor of Michigan may have been kidnapped, and when I hear some of these things, it concerns me that they're breaking up beyond that fringe. Is that where we are now?
Yeah, I think the way I've been thinking about it, and I should say I've been using this metaphor since before the pandemic, so it's a little bit more awkward now to use it, but I think for a long time we thought of extremism in general, and far-right extremism in particular, as being like a few bad cells, a cancerous or tumor that could be isolated, monitored and surveilled, cut out of society. And as long as we kept it separate, whether through imprisonment or surveillance or just isolation, it wouldn't touch everybody else. And I think if we start to understand this kind of disease as much more of a virus that is contagious, that certain people are more susceptible to, and we can reduce those vulnerabilities to it through education and preventative measures, then it's a different kind of a thing. And I think when we think about the contagion of online hate, that's the way it works. It spreads in ways that aren't bounded just by what you can do as a parent or a teacher, because you can't control everywhere the young person spends time online in the same ways that we might think we could have controlled before. It's not as much a destination anymore. You don't have to go to a backwoods militia or an Aryan Brotherhood prison gang to encounter this stuff. It will come to you in mainstream spaces at some point. And so knowing what to do when you encounter it, I think, is part of the problem. And I think if we approach it that way, it starts to look a little bit different in terms of the ways that we can combat it.
Fascinating. All right, that kind of sets the table for our discussion. We're going to take a break now.
Great.
We'll come back and we'll start taking some phone calls. If you want to call in, a couple lines open, 737 plus 615 737 7587. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.